Hi guys, I am at school and I am going to go ahead and read out loud from our online textbook, History Alive, the Ancient World, Chapter 35, Daily Life in Ancient Rome. How did wealth affect daily life in the Roman Empire? 35.1 Introduction. In this chapter, you'll explore the daily life of people living in the Roman Empire at the height of its power, around 100 CE. All roads lead to Rome, boasted the Romans. For thousands of miles, road markers showed the distance to Rome, but more than roads connected the empire's 50 million people. They also were connected by Roman law, Roman customs, and Roman military might. If Rome was the center of the empire, the Forum was the center of Rome. The word forum means gathering place. The original forum was an open area used for merchant stalls and for viewing races, games, and plays. In time, the Forum became a sprawling complex of government buildings, meeting halls, temples, theaters, and monuments. This was the heart of life in Rome. In this chapter, you will visit this bustling center of Rome's vast empire. You'll learn about 8 areas of daily life in ancient Rome and discover how life differed for the rich and the poor. Daily life in ancient Rome. If you visited Rome in the 1st century CE, you would have seen a city of great contrast. Nearly 1 million people lived in the empire's capital city. Rome was full of beautiful temples, stately palaces, and flowering gardens. Yet most of its people lived in tiny apartments crammed into narrow, dirty streets. In the city's forum or public gathering place, wealthy Roman women shopped for goods accompanied by their slaves. Proud senators strolled about protected by their bodyguards, while soldiers marched through the streets. Merchants and craftspeople labored at their trades. Foreigners roamed the streets from such faraway places as Britain, Spain, and Egypt, and in the midst of it all were Roman slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, many of them captured in war. People and goods flowed into Rome from the 4 corners of the empire. Wealthy Romans spent great sums of money on silks, perfumes, jeweled weapons, and musical instruments. They decorated their homes with statues, fountains, and fine pottery. But the rich were only a small part of Rome's population. Most of the city's people lived in filthy neighborhoods filled with crime and disease. Their children were lucky to live past age 10. To keep the poor from turning into an angry, dangerous mob, Roman emperors gave away food and provided entertainment, such as gladiator contests and chariot races. The empire had many large cities, but most people lived in the countryside. There, too, most of the people were poor. Some worked their own small farms, others labored on huge estates owned by the rich. Law and Order, 35.3. The Romans always believed in the rule of law. In the days of the Republic, the Senate and the assemblies were important sources of law. But in the empire, the ultimate source of law was the emperor. As one Roman judge said, whatever pleases the emperor is the law. Even in the empire, however, Romans honored some of their old traditions. The Senate continued to meet, and senators held high status in society. They had their own styles of clothing. They might wear special rings, pins, or togas, or robes, trimmed with wide purple stripe. Important senators had their own bodyguards. These guards carried fasces, bundles of sticks with an axe in the center. The fasces were symbols of the government's right to punish lawbreakers. When carried inside the city, the axe was removed to symbolize the right of the Roman citizen to appeal a ruling against them. Roman laws were strict, but crime was common in Rome. The most frequent crimes were stealing, assault, and murder. Roman police kept an eye on wealthy neighborhoods, but rarely patrolled poor sections of the city. Some streets were so dangerous they were closed at night. Romans tried to protect themselves against crime. Rich men tried to hide their wealth by wearing old, dirty togas when they traveled at night. Women and children in rich families were told never to go outdoors alone, even during the day. Any Roman, including the poor, could accuse someone else of a crime. A jury of citizens decided the case. Accused persons sometimes tried to win the jury's sympathy. They might wear rags or dirty clothes to court or have their wives and children sob in front of the jury. Romans believed that one law should apply to all citizens. Still, under the empire, Roman law was not applied equally. The poor, who were often not citizens, faced harsher punishments than the rich, sometimes even torture. 35.4 Religion. Religion was important to the Romans. As you may know, the Romans adopted many Greek gods. They also adopted gods from other cultures to create their own group of gods. Romans wanted to please their gods because they believed that the gods controlled their daily lives. As Rome's many temples and shrines, people made offerings and promises to the gods. They often left gifts of food, such as honey cakes and fruit. They also sacrificed animals, including bulls, sheep, and oxen. When someone was sick or injured, Romans would leave a small offering at the temple in the shape of the hurt part of the body. For instance, they might leave a clay foot to remind the god which part of the body to cure. Festivals and holidays or holy days were held throughout the year to honor the gods, but religion was also part of daily life. Each home had an altar where the family worshipped its own household gods and spirits. The family hearth or fireplace was sacred to the goddess Vesta. During the main meal, the family threw a small cake into the fire as an offering to Vesta. In time, the Romans came to honor their emperors as gods. One emperor, Caligula, had a temple built to house the statue of himself made of gold. Every day the statue was dressed in a certain type of clothes that Caligula was wearing that day. As the empire grew, foreigners brought new forms of worship to Rome. The Romans welcomed most of these new religions as long as they didn't encourage disloyalty to the emperor. 35.5 Family life. Family life in Rome was ruled by paterfamilies, or father of the family. A Roman father's word was law in his own home. Even his grown sons and daughters had to obey him. Roman men were expected to provide for the family. In richer families, husbands often held well-paid political positions. In poor families, both husbands and wives had to work in order to feed and care for themselves and their children. Wealthy Roman women ran their households. They bought and trained the family slaves. Many had money of their own and were active in business. They bought and sold property. Roman babies were usually born at home. The Romans kept only strong, healthy babies. If the father didn't approve of a newborn, it was left outside to die or be claimed as a slave. Romans found it strange that other people, such as the Egyptians, raised all their children. Babies were named in a special ceremony when they were 9 days old. A good luck charm, called a bulla, was placed around the baby's neck. Children wore their bullas throughout childhood. Between the ages of 14 and 18, a Roman boy celebrated becoming a man. In a special ceremony, he offered his bulla along with his childhood toys and clothes to the gods. Roman girls did not have a ceremony to mark the end of childhood. They became adults when they were married, usually between the ages of 12 and 18. Weddings were held at a temple. The bride wore a white toga with a long veil. The groom also wore a white toga, along with leather shoes that he shined with animal fat. But the new husband did not become a paterfamilias until his own father died. 35.6 Food and drink. What Romans cooked and ate depended on whether they were rich or poor. Only the rich had kitchen in their homes. The poor cooked on small grills and depended on fast food places called thermopolia, where people could buy hot and cold foods that were ready to eat. Even the rich often bought their daytime meals at the thermopolia because the service was fast and convenient. The main foods in ancient Rome were bread, beans, spices, a few vegetables, cheese, and meats. Favorite drinks included plain water and hot water with herbs and honey. For breakfast, Romans usually ate a piece of bread and a bowl of beans or porridge. Porridge was an oatmeal-like cereal made from grains like barley or wheat. Lunch might include a small bit of cheese and bread and perhaps some olives or celery. For dinner, poor Romans might have chunks of fish along with some asparagus and a fig for dessert. Wealthy Romans ate more elaborate dinners. Besides the main part of the meal, they had special appetizers. Some favorites were mice cooked in honey, roasted parrots stuffed with dates, salted jellyfish, and snails dipped in milk. Roman markets offered many choices to those who could afford them. Wealthy Roman women or slaves shopped for the perfect foods for fancy dinner parties. Merchants often kept playful monkeys or colorful birds on display to attract customers. Shelves were packed with fruits, live rabbits, chickens, geese, baskets of snails, and cuts of meat. Large clay jars were filled with salty fish sauce called garum that the Romans liked to pour over the main dish at dinner. Housing. 35.7. Like food, housing was very different in Rome for the rich and for the poor. The spacious, airy homes of the rich stood side by side with the small, dark apartments that housed the poor. Wealthy Romans lived in grand houses built of stone and marble. Thick walls shut out the noise and dirt of the city. Inside the front door was a hall called an atrium where the family received guests. An indoor pool helped keep the atrium cool. An opening in the roof let in plenty of light. Beyond the atrium, there were many rooms for the family and guests. The fanciest room was the dining room. Its walls were covered with pictures, both painted murals and mosaics made of tiles. Mosaics also decorated the floors. Graceful statues stood in the corners. Some dining rooms had beautiful fountains in the center to provide guests with cool water. During dinner parties, guests lay on couches and ate delicious meals prepared by slaves. While they ate, they listened to music played by slaves on flutes and stringed instruments such as the lyre and the lute. Nearby, many of the poor crowded into tall apartment buildings. Others lived in small apartments above the shops where they worked. Without proper kitchens, the poor cooked their meals on small portable grills in the rooms filled with smoke. The apartments were cramped, noisy, and dirty. Filth and disease-carrying rats caused sicknesses to spread rapidly. Fire was another danger. Many of the buildings were made of wood, and in the cooking grills caught fire easily. In 64 CE, a disastrous fire broke out that burned down much of the city. 35.8 Education. If you'd grown up in ancient Rome, your education would have depended on the type of family you were born into. Many poor children in Rome were sent to work instead of to school. They learned trades such as leatherworking and metalworking to help earn money for their families. In wealthier families, boys and girls were tutored by their fathers or often by slaves until they were about 6 years old. Then boys went off to school. Classes were held in public buildings and private homes. Many of the tutors were educated Greek slaves. A typical school day in Rome began very early in the morning. Students walked through crowded streets carrying their supplies in a leather shoulder bag. On the way, they stopped at local breakfast bars. There they bought beans, nuts, and freshly baked bread to munch on while they walked to class. Once at school, students sat on small stools around the tutor. They used a pointed pen called a stylus to copy down lessons on small wax-covered wooden boards. When the lessons were over, they rubbed out the writing with the flat end of the stylus so they could use the board again. The school day lasted until 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Roman boys learned Latin, Greek, math, science, literature, music, and public speaking. They typically became soldiers, doctors, politicians, or lawyers. Girls might become dentists, real estate agents, or tutors. Some female slaves or freed women could become midwives, nurses who helped with childbirth. Upper-class boys stayed in school until the age 12 or 13. Boys from very wealthy families often continued their studies until they were 16 when they began to manage their own property. 35.9 Recreation. There were many forms of recreation in Rome. Wealthy Romans had a lot of leisure because slaves did the work. The rich enjoyed plays in the theaters and musical performances in one another's homes. Both rich and poor often relaxed in Romans' public baths. There they could bathe, swim, and exercise and enjoy a steam bath or massage. The baths also had gardens, libraries, shops, and art galleries. Roman emperors made sure to give poor bread and circuses, food and entertainment to keep them busy and happy. Besides the many festivals throughout the year, rich and poor alike flocked to 2 spectacles, gladiator contests and chariot races. Romans watched gladiators fight in large public areas like the Colosseum. Both men and women were gladiators. Usually they were slaves or prisoners of war, although some won or bought their freedom in time. The crowd shouted as the gladiators fought each other and wild animals to the death. Many thousands of gladiators died bloody and painful deaths for the entertainment of spectators. A favorite gathering place was the Circus Maximus, a huge racetrack with room for 200,000 spectators. There, Romans watched thrilling chariot races. Wealthy citizens sat on plush cushions close to the track, with shade protecting them from the sun. The poor sat on wooden benches high above the track. The men and women sat in separate sections at the Colosseum but could sit together at the Circus Maximus. A Roman poet said the Circus Maximus was the best place to meet a new boyfriend or girlfriend because you never knew who would sit next to you. 35.10 Country Life. Rome was one of the many cities scattered throughout the Roman Empire, but 90% of the empire's people lived in the country. There, too, rich and poor had very different lives. Wealthy Romans often owned country estates with large homes called villas. A villa was a place for Romans to invest their money in raising crops and livestock. It was a pleasant place to relax in the summer heat. When they went to the country, wealthy estate owners checked on how their farms were being managed, but they had plenty of time left over for reading and writing as well as for hunting, picnicking, and taking long walks in the fresh air. The empire's farms provided much food for Rome and other cities. They produced grain for bread, grapes for wine, and olives for oil. Goats and sheep provided cheese, and their skins and wool were made into clothing. Cattle and pigs were raised for their meat. Farmers also kept bees for making honey, the sweetener used by Romans. Slaves did much of the actual work of farming. Overseers or supervisors kept a close eye on the slaves, often treated them cruelly. Many people in the country were not slaves, but their lives were hard. They lived in huts and worked on their own small farms, trying to earn enough to survive. Or they labored on the estates, tending the animals, helping with the crops, or working as servants. In the 1st century CE, Paul of Tarsus, a Christian writer, summed up the lives of the empire's poor. He wrote, "He who does not work shall not eat." I'm going to try and also finish the chapter summary before this stops. In this chapter, you learned about daily life for the rich and the poor in the Roman Empire. Rome was a large, thriving capital city. Life in ancient Rome, nearly 1 million people lived in the city of Rome. The Forum was its center. The empire had many large cities, but most people lived in the country. Law and order. Romans believed in the rule of law. Laws were strict, but crime was common. Any Roman could accuse someone else of a crime. A jury decided the case. Religion. Religion was a part of daily life. Romans made offerings to the gods. Festivals and holy days were held throughout the year. Each home had an altar for household gods and spirits. The Romans also honored their emperors as gods. Family life. Each family was ruled by the paterfamilias. At 9 days old, a baby was given a bulla, which he or she wore throughout childhood. Between 14 and 18, a boy became a man. Girls became adults when they were married, between 12 and 18. Food, drink, and housing. Only the rich had kitchens. The poor cooked on small grills or bought fast food. The main foods were bread, beans, spices, vegetables, cheeses, meats, and garum. Drinks included water and hot water with herbs and honey. The rich lived in large houses built around a central atrium. The poor crowded into apartment buildings. Education and recreation. More poor children in Rome learned trades instead of going to school. Wealthier boys and girls were tutored by their fathers or by slaves until they were about 6. Then the boys went to school. Roman boys learned Latin, Greek, math, science, literature, music, and public speaking. Upper-class boys stayed in school until 12 or 13. The rich enjoyed plays and musical performances. Both rich and poor often relaxed in the Rome's public baths. Besides celebrating many festivals, rich and poor alike enjoyed viewing gladiator contests and chariot races. Country life. 90% of the empire's people lived in the country. The wealthy often owned villas. Farms provided much of the food for cities. Slaves did much of the farm work. Many country people were not slaves, but their lives were hard. They lived in huts and worked their own small farms or on great estates. And that is the end of chapter 38.